Hi there. Welcome to another episode of Wikipedia Weekly. I am Andrew Lee, also known as user Fuzzheado on English Wikipedia. Well, thank you for joining us for our end of the year 2020 review of the top 10 stories in the movement. And there's a lot that's happened this year. It's a lot more than 10 stories, but we're trying to boil it down to the 10 big things that we can hone in on for the end of the year. But before we get started, let's bring in our panelists one by one. Hi, Richard. Tell us where you are and what you're up to.
Hi, Richard, user Pharos, coming to you from New York City, the most wiki of all cities. I'm glad to join us at this end of this difficult year 2020. Hopefully we have a more positive 2021.
Great. And Vera.
Hi, I'm Vera, coming to you from the Netherlands. I'm a Wikipedian and developer. Thank you. And thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us. And we have Jan.
Hello, Jan Einali, your user Einali on the wikis. I'm in Amsterdam right now, but I'm from Sweden and the Swedish Wikimedia chapter, or right now, Wikimedians for Sustainable Development.
Excellent. And we have Bill.
Hello, my name is Bill Butler. I am WWB on Wikipedia. I also write a blog occasionally called The Wikipedian, and every year for about the last decade, I've written my own list of the top 10 stories in Wikipedia and the Wikimedia movement. So I think coming on the show today is a good merging of the brands to consider what's happened in the year in the Wiki movement.
Yeah, thank you. And if you don't know, Bill has been a mainstay. He's been the most consistent guy doing the top 10 stories of every year. We're kind of new to this as the podcast, doing a year-end show. And if it wasn't for folks like Bill, we wouldn't be inspired to do things like this. And so thanks for keeping the drumbeat alive, even as we on this show kind of come and go with different ideas on what to do these types of stories. So just a little bit of background, the list that we have is really not a strict priority in terms of importance, but we did put out a list of possible stories to the Wikipedia Weekly Facebook group, and people could add whatever they wanted to the list, and people could rank them up and down. So we had probably, 50 plus responses, and probably more if you do a complete tally. And it's a pretty nice reflection of the priorities that people had in voting for these things. But we took some liberties to move things around as needed or to cluster some of those things. So this is just one group's take on it. It's not meant to be definitive. In fact, we're pretty sure we are looking at a very narrow slice of what's going on in the movement. So we encourage folks watching to bring in your comments, to challenge us on these things, to add stories from your community. And the nice thing about this is we can bring up your comments on the screen. And we want you to tell us where you're watching from and to tweet out this link to other folks, or to share it on YouTube, or to like it on YouTube, or to share it out on Facebook. Let other folks know, because the nice thing about a live show is we get to incorporate your responses and to react directly to the things that you're bringing to this. So just to quickly welcome some of the folks that we have here. We have folks from Sweden, from Minneapolis, from India, and from Singapore. Wow, that's pretty diverse. So thanks, folks, for watching at all different hours. And we tried to choose this as the possible time where most of the world is awake. I think this is the best time. So 1600 UTC for the show. So before we get started, let's bring up our handy dandy top 10 list on the screen. And let's get started. So one of the biggest stories, and the one that probably is not the most important story, but it's something we felt that we wanted to just bring up first in this whole thing, was, of course, the impact of COVID-19. So I think this is certainly one that's obvious, but it kind of runs through the entire theme of the top 10 list here. So thoughts, folks, in terms of our 1 year of craziness in our movement. And Jan, I don't know, I think you have some perspective on what has happened in 2020 and how COVID has affected our movement.
Well, it's been affecting everything, but first of all, it's been affecting how we meet, and that has changed a lot. I think we might even return to that later on in the show. But it's also, in some ways, also impacted the way Wikipedia is perceived in the world, because we have been one of the steady platforms delivering credible information.
Yeah, and for the folks in the audience, feel free to chime in your comments as to how COVID affected the movement in obvious and not so obvious ways. Vera, how about you? What would you remind? What would you take away from 2020's the COVID's impact on the movement?
Well, for the Dutch chapter, we had a lot more contact with the territories that speak Dutch but aren't necessarily aren't part of the Netherlands itself. So there are some small islands in the Caribbean that have Dutch as their main language, and in the past we've tried to build bridges with them from time to time, but those efforts didn't really come as much off the ground as they did this year. We could get people involved in meetups that weren't necessarily focused on the Caribbean itself, and so overall that's quite a positive new thing in the Dutch chapter.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And one of the weird things about this is that because there are no in real life meetups at all, suddenly the folks who couldn't typically go to these face-to-face meetups in a weird way, they kind of felt more included because they weren't outsiders. Like everyone was an outsider this year. So we had to find new ways to include folks in what was going on. Bill, how about your views on 2020?
Well, as regards COVID, I certainly think this is more than should be higher in the list than number 10, because this really, I mean, it impacted just about everything in the entire world, of course. On Wikipedia, as noted here, it interrupted and paused all of the IRL interactions that folks like us, like Andrew, I know you've gone to the Wikimania every single year in the last 10 years or so, and this is 1 year. There wasn't one for you to go to. And then online itself, COVID-19 has been, still is, the focus of some of the most intense editing activity that Wikipedia has seen in many years. For the first time in a long time, the English Wikipedia added a new information box to its front page about providing links to resources for COVID, information about it. That was something that was not a decision taken lightly and is unlikely to be repeated again. So COVID, yes, extremely important, extremely impactful. I don't know where it is, but it's definitely higher than number 10. When I publish my list, it'll be higher.
Yeah, there's some conceit in putting it number 10. Basically, it's every item, but we decided to introduce it first, so we got it addressed. But you're right. Richard, how about you?
We have a very sophisticated numbering system. It reflects not only importance, it reflects priority, it reflects chronology and cause and effect. So we're just operating on several different levels beyond your list, I just have to say. I think COVID-19 is obviously very important for this year. I think we're entering the 20th anniversary of Wikipedia now. I think, COVID-19 in some ways parallels the information crisis of 20 years ago. I said when we launched the live stream version of this podcast, in that there's a lot of misinformation in the world. There's a lot of lack of information, and Wikipedia and Wikimedia can help deal with that. And I think it is helping to deal with that through this crisis. I mean, also this misinformation about where the virus came from, the efficacy of vaccines and masks, and something like Wikipedia has an especially important purpose at this time. And I think it's vital that we address that. And I think we've done a fairly good job overall. And I hope we can hear from Netha, who's having some connection problems, but might be able to join us. Has been one of the leading editors, certainly this year, in sharing COVID information, which is particularly valuable to share.
The COVID has also put Wikipedia to a test, sort of, in actually trying to share and store data across projects. Which we now also have been updating every day. In the beginning, we had these tables, like new cases everywhere, and trying to have that updated and fresh on all the language projects. And it also showed the limits of Wikidata in some sense.
Yeah, we've had people use structured data on Commons in unusual ways for COVID data, which is, it's not what it's intended for, but it was the tool that was available that works. So that's kind of interesting, that storing, disease data on Commons, which is supposed to be our image and sound library. So people make use of what they can in an emergency.
Yeah, actually, in one of our editathons early this year, I think it was sponsored by you, Jan, or someone, that I discovered that, hey, we have a data namespace in Commons. We can store like tabular data or spreadsheet data. I didn't know that. But of course, the tools are not really built out for it yet, but we do have that capability. But maybe this is the whip that gets us into shape, saying we really need this for cross-project collaboration for data. Right? Yeah, that's great. So thank you for that. Again, I take the blame. Richard wanted to make these in no particular order, but I was too rigid in my thinking about ordering here. So what is next after 10? 9. Well, this is a lot of different things and tech changes. Some of the things are apparent to the public, but some are not. But probably the biggest one is the new skin that we have, right? Does anyone want to speak to what are the new features of the skin, which I kind of like, but we really haven't had a lot of esoteric changes like this before.
Well, for me, being able to use the new citation model in the source editor was really nice. On the English language Wikipedia, I still edit in the source mode, but I'm also now able to generate a pretty reference with the Citoids module in the new interface. So I hope that's going to be possible on the Dutch language Wikipedia as well soon. I wasn't yet able to enable that, or maybe it is. There's always these new things that you have to be sort of already part of the crowd to know there's a new thing you can enable, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that's one of the challenges is these features roll out very inconsistently, even for the largest editions of Wikipedia. It's always a mystery as to what you can depend on or not depend on in the different language editions. But anyone have any feedback on the new skin?
I do think actually it's kind of nice that I mean, obviously there's inconsistency, but I think it is kind of nice that it rolls out on different languages at different times, different projects, so people can like play with it. And some languages can choose to be more adventurous than others, and that's kind of nice. So it starts maybe at some of the smaller projects and some of the larger, more adventurous projects, and then if it's accepted, it can go everywhere. So it's nice that we don't have just like the same thing in every language.
Right.
To advantage of our movement.
Yeah, and regarding the skin, I have very mixed feelings because I have this large screen set up and high, a lot of pixels, and now it gets constrained to 960 pixels width, which means I have a lot of white space on my screen, which I'm not very happy with. But also, in a sense, perhaps this is something that will be, especially for readers, useful and easier to find their way about, and also perhaps also making it easier to lay out articles, even though I don't really like layouting articles, making layout or design for articles.
So I have to say, I completely forgot that this even happened. And so I went and checked my preferences to see which version of Vector I was using. And it turns out I was still on the old one. So I switched it over. Now I'm looking at the new one. And I'll tell you what, right now I prefer the old one. This is how it always goes. I assume if I decide to keep this, I'll get used to it. I find it weird to shove all the links up into the top right corner.
Mm-hmm.
But I can see that it feels to me like it is trying to do a similar thing that Apple is doing with its new Big Sur operating system. For those of you who use Apple's ecosystem, it's trying to create more white space, trying to create softer lines between different parts of the interface. It's risky because things can start to get confusing, but if you pull it off, it can be quite pleasing. And I don't have I only have been looking at it for about 3 minutes now. I prefer the old way, though. I will say that.
Yeah, I think, Jan, I didn't even think of that until you mentioned it, that I realized one day when I resized it, I'm like, wait a minute, I have this 27-inch monitor that's really not being used well here. And I'd love to hear from other folks in the comments in the chat. Like, what are your experiences been? I kind of like the clean look of like turning off this random list. I mean, this is really getting unwieldy on the left-hand side here, right? So it is kind of nice to have it clean, but you're right. Like it's not really taking advantage of the space, though, is it?
No, and also all these links for me as an editor, like I use them all the time.
Right.
So at least I want a shortcut for the flipping it in and out, the left margin.
And I like random links. You know, I think they're kind of fun. I think they should be more random. I think we should have like votes every week on which links get to go there. That's my perspective.
Well, isn't discovery also a challenge? If someone does happen to close up that box, they are less likely to find something like, you know, recent changes or,
right,
you know, Wikidata item and learn more. So it's one of these changes that is more geared toward a smooth reader experience and less toward the active encouragement of new editors, which is a long recurring, long-lasting concern. I'm a little surprised.
I guess there's probably a term for this type of web design. I've seen it mainly, I guess, in the New York Times. When I read the New York Times, it has like a lot of white space on the left and the right.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe this should have a concept on Wikipedia and in Wikidata. So if someone wants to write that, I don't know what the word is, but it must have a word somewhere because people are making money from it.
Yeah, there might already be one.
There might already be one. So if you can help us find it, then thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, you're right. I don't know if there's a name for the design aesthetic, but I think Bill hit on it. Is like the fact that tablets and mobiles are like 60+% of the users out there. That why would we spend so much time in real estate on this when we can clean it up? But you're right that it does hide a lot of what we want new editors to see when they want to get involved here. The other story that we wanted to highlight as well was the fact that Toolforge.org is now the kind of the official new place for all of these tools that maybe the average Wikipedia user never sees, but for a lot of us who are working in the depths of the Wikimedia community, this is a pretty big deal because now all these tools that used to be WMF Labs are now Toolforge.org. And there's on the back end, at least, we're now using what they call Kubernetes, which is like this very advanced distributed computing software that is pretty popular out there. So a lot of things behind the scenes are pretty significant in terms of making systems at scale for the technology side and this new domain that is hosting all of our stuff here. So Vera, you're a developer and you've probably worked with Toolforge.org. Any other comments or things in the tech world that we should be paying attention to for 2020?
Well, the migration to Toolforge was quite effortless for me. I didn't have to change anything myself. It was all done for me, so that was nice. I was the one that updated the manual for Windows users because I guess there aren't all that many Windows users. It's always like sometimes you come across tasks within the Wikimedia project. You're like, shouldn't that have already been done by somebody, or have strictly been assigned to somebody? But I guess it's now assigned to me to keep Windows instructions up to date for Toolforge, since I'm one of the few Windows computer users, I guess. I hope there aren't all that many more changes coming because it's not that, changing.
In fact, you're right. That there was already a change from something to WMF Labs, and then now there's a WMF Labs to Toolforge, and it breaks a lot of stuff on the back end, right? That you don't watch out.
Hi everyone. I just want to just share. So we did a couple comments about the white space. So Katie said it may be a responsive design. We had a comment that dark mode might be a better solution. I just want to introduce Netha Hussain, who was not able to join us earlier, but was able to join us now. We might cover maybe COVID-19 health topics more in depth in a little bit, but I wanted to just add Netha to the conversation for now. Hi, Netha. Welcome.
Hi, Netha.
Hello.
Thank you. Hello.
Welcome.
Hello.
So tell us where you are and what you're up to.
I'm living in Sweden now, and I'm working as a doctor. And yes, the last patient I saw had COVID-19. Yes, so I fight COVID-19 in real time. And yes, I do write articles related to anything related to medicine these days, but I mostly focus on disinformation related to COVID-19. Thank you for inviting me here. Yeah.
Well, thanks for being with us. If you haven't seen, Netha did a great webinar types show with Richard with Wikimedia New York City. So definitely go take a look at that. That was great in the, I wouldn't say early days. It's hard to tell where the early days of COVID are now, but like kind of when we're in the middle of the pandemic in the earlier 2020, that was really great to have experts knowing what they're talking about misinformation on Wikipedia. So what were some of the highlights? Because number 10 was about COVID, but maybe it's some observations about what was the impact of COVID on our community in terms of getting us to adapt to that reality of COVID-19.
I think that the community became more global because we all get to work. We don't get to work in offline outreach programs. We don't meet in offline conferences. So I think that the community became more and more online, doing more online work than before. Of course, we are primarily an online movement, but then we became more global and we started having more collaborations online. So I think that's one of the biggest changes that I've observed. And in terms of medicine, Wikiproject Medicine, I think that we have started relying, there has been more discussion surrounding disinformation related to medicine this year. Until then, we as Wikimedians recognized that misinformation was a big problem. But when it came to COVID-19, the media took up stories about this. There was a lot of discussion about how misinformation circulated on the internet. And I think the World Health Organization also recognized this and called it an infodemic. And they collaborated with the Wikimedia movement. They had a partnership with us where they agreed to share some of their content, COVID-19 related content, under CC license so that we could reuse them on Wikipedia. So I think these are some of the big changes that COVID-19 brought to our movement.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about conferences and events that kind of forced, or the cancellation of those that forced us to kind of shift our gears. And I think in many ways has been beneficial to globalizing our movement. Thank you. So the next thing that we had on our list was, if I could move this, oops. WMF Board of Trustees bylaws changes. Well, this is a little sticky. This is a big issue that we have 5 minutes to talk about. This is a number of things. I think, how do we address this in sequence? I think one of the things that might have been something that folks missed was that back in April of 2020, because of COVID and because of how we're still maybe in April still trying to figure out how badly this would affect the movement, the board decided to postpone the election of community selected board seats till the next year in 2021. And that was just kind of done in an April resolution by the Wikimedia Foundation board. And I think most people were pretty understanding at the time, saying, yeah, this is kind of chaotic and maybe that's appropriate. But then what happened was in the second half of 2020, there were a number of bylaw changes that were planned for a while, but had proposed some things around how the board seats would be selected. And that was pretty controversial and caused a lot of debate in the community. So maybe Richard or Jan, you've been watching this. What's a good way to summarize what the bylaw changes were and the reaction to that?
I guess the main shift in the language, in the wording of the language of the bylaws, was to change from community selected board seats to community sourced board seats. And so like with organic food, sourcing can be an ambiguous term. And so it could encompass any number of things. There was some discussion about a rubric that might establish, different areas of professional experience or diversity. But it was a bit vague, and there was some difference between different board members about what that might mean in practice. And I don't think there's entirely agreement about it. I mean, personally, I think the goal of diversity is a good one and one we should pursue and one we can actually bake into the process more than we have now. But I am concerned about designing it as a self-perpetuating board, as a board that appoints itself, which is, I think, not where the Wikimedia movement should be going. We should be looking at gender diversity. We should be looking at geographical diversity. But I don't think that means that everything has to be appointed from the top down. And I think this requires some more thought.
Right. Any other thoughts from folks? I'm putting up here a comparison of the changes that were put forth by the board relating to the existing bylaws on the left and then the new ones on the right. And I think one of the things that came out of this was we had a, and we'll talk about this later on, we had a group of affiliate folks talk with the Wikimedia Foundation legal counsel over some of the concerns that Richard talked about here in terms of the new proposed bylaws not necessarily guaranteeing, actually not guaranteeing that the majority of board members would be community selected, even though that might have been their intent. If you look at the letter of what they proposed, it would not have been a requirement. And the meeting that we had with the legal counsel, Amanda Keaton, she told us, you found a bug. So we did point out the problem, and she did readily admit, we did not realize that was a flaw in the plan. So they're going back to rework that, to bring it back to the community. But that doesn't necessarily solve the community sourced issue, as Richard pointed out. Whereas right now we do have selected versus community sourced. So there's still some ambiguity there, but at least the issue of will the majority of the seats on the board be from the community through a selection process, which had been eliminated in the bylaws proposal, they're going to try to rework back into it. At least that's what they're telling us right now. So that
was it a bug? Was it a bug, or was it a feature that was rejected by the users and now has to be taken out?
I'm just quoting what someone said. Well, let's just put it this way. You know our community. There's a lot of spilled bites around this issue. Yep. But Vera or Jan, any feedback on this?
I think it was also a little bit like you mentioned in the beginning with the timing, like first postponing and then coming with changes that would also affect the people that were giving extra time. It all went in a weird way to me.
I think you're right. A lot of people pointed that out, saying, wait a minute, you're making major changes to the board, but with 3 members of the board who are actually maybe not supposed to be on the board given the existing bylaws. So there was some questions around that. You're right. So this is just some more elaboration here. I think one of our community members did a great job of putting them side to side and color coding them so we can kind of see the differences there. And I think, I'm trying to be as fair as possible to the foundation folks, but I think it would have helped a lot more if they spent more time on this, because the announcement of these changes used some very specific language, and the language read that they were very carefully considered. The announcement said the board has very carefully considered the published revisions, which meant that when we read them, we were like, well, this is getting close to final then. Because if you say you carefully considered the revisions, okay, right here, right, then that means that we should really, really, really take these seriously. And in fact, I don't think they were in sync. I think that they thought it was kind of a draft. They said they were carefully considered, and then that disconnect caused a lot of confusion in the community. So I'm glad that they're going back to the drawing board and they're opening a dialogue to the community. So I think that's a pretty good encapsulation of a really big issue. And for folks who are interested in more of this, dig into the pages that we're pointing to here, because it's not a simple thing to dissect, but hopefully can give you the 10,000-foot view of this issue. Any other comments about this this topic? I mean, we have only 5 minutes per topic, so it's not going to be solved with this so quickly. All right, so let's go back into our countdown. What do we have? We have next. Safety, Universal Code of Conduct. Get used to this acronym. Not everyone kind of knew what this was when we started talking about UCOC and this board resolutions regarding safety. So Richard, maybe you can steer us through this. You've been paying more attention to UCOC, or maybe Jan and Vera. I honestly have not been following it as closely as I could.
I mean, I don't know if I've been following it as closely as I should either, but there has been obviously a draft UCOC. It was helped develop by a volunteer committee, and it's been developed by people at the Wikimedia Foundation and elsewhere. It's gotten some support, some concerns about it. I guess the main tension is universalism versus particularism. If I can make it very abstract, what should be what should be like the universal roles, what should be more particular. A lot of concern about obviously the basic standards of civility and and treating people like human beings, which should be a standard of the movement, and balancing that against is something designed, say, in American cultural context versus some other cultural context. And so there's been some disagreements about that. But I think there is general support among many for just the proposition as a whole. There's also been like some various discussions about related to safety. Like for example, there was concern about the LGBT issues. Particularly, the foundation had a series of surveys that were designed with sort of binary male and female responses. That got some concern from Wikimedia LGBT and the community there, and there was a sort of a statement about that, sort of apologizing for that issue. And so there are a few different things involved.
Right. Other views on this universal code of conduct?
I do work with codes of conduct for online communities in my regular day work, and I've been looking at this and commenting on the draft so far, and I think it's a really good step in the right direction. It's going to provide the community more tools to handle with the kind of problems that we usually see on the wikis.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's heartening to hear. We're going in the right direction. It's got the right basic outline. And what are the next steps? Do we know what the timeline is for this? There's a community. There's a community kind of committee that's working on this. Here's the timeline. So it looks like in January 2021, they're going to be going on to the next phase of this.
Yes, I guess the next phase is going to handle the enforcing of the code of conduct. So now we have actually set the stage for what is the kind of behavior we want to see and what we don't want to see. But the next phase is, well, when we don't see other kinds of behavior, what will we do? How can we enforce it? And that's where we're entering now.
Right.
And I think that's going to be a tougher thing to deal with and negotiate through the different communities.
Right. Great. Well, keep an eye on that. I think the Universal Code of Conduct folks have been briefing the community in different venues, including phone calls and things like that, or video calls. So it's been pretty good so far, at least from what I've seen. All right. So number 6. Portuguese Wikipedia disables all IP editing. Now, none of us are Portuguese speakers here, so I don't know what we can add to this other than, wow, I didn't know that was going to be a thing. So any reactions to Portuguese Wikipedia disables all IP editing?
I think it'll be interesting to see if other small Wikipedias do that as well. And Portuguese is not the smallest of Wikipedias. It's kind of more mid-sized. It's got 1 million articles and about 1,400 active contributors. That's still much, much smaller than the English, the German, the Spanish Wikipedias. I think one of the long-term bets that Wikipedia has made is that it's better to, allow for some IP vandalism in the hopes of getting, fresh blood into the editing ecosystem, is one that I would not have made, but I think probably on the biggest projects works. But on the smaller ones, I'm not sure that equation works the same. So I think it'll be a fascinating experiment to see if it actually, apparently it has led to an increase in new account signups. I think it'd be good to encourage people to actually kind of plant their flag and be involved more if they're inclined to do so. So I think it's fascinating. I want to see someone else try and see where it goes.
Yeah, I had a question just because, of course, IP editing works differently in different languages. What I didn't realize is, English Wikipedia, a few years ago, we shut off IP creation of new articles, but we still allow IP editing of existing articles. And so I think, but apparently that is not a normal case. Of course, it seems like most Wikipedias still allow IPs to do either of those, including Portuguese Wikipedia, until they made this change. So they went toward this direction of English Wikipedia and took a step farther. and they had some, concerns about, I don't know, there's some thought that, they were seeing more vandalism than other wikis. There might be some political issues involved.
Well, I know,
People share.
yeah. Well, I know the German and Russian language Wikipedia doesn't publish edits by IPs or even very young accounts immediately. So those still first need to be reviewed before they go live. And that would have been my preferred option for the Portuguese Wikipedia as well, though that still, relies on volunteers reviewing and a backlog almost immediately being created of things to be reviewed. But yeah, that's still better than closing everything down. I think it's already so hard to get people to understand that Wikipedia isn't this static thing that is created by some institute where there's a very strong barrier for starting to participate. It's really you that can change something if you see something that needs changing. In almost all cases, and that, yeah, it's a bit sad, but you can't. There's also a limit to how much you can rely on volunteers to review edits that might not be as productive as you might want.
Right. We have a comment from Liam White here. I am interested to see how Portuguese banning of IP editing affects new editor retention compared to how Polish and German Wikipedias require several hundred edits approved before your edits are shown automatically, right? So this is what Vera was referring to. But if you don't know that they're using pending revisions by default, right, on German Wikipedia. So
Flagged revisions.
I'm sorry, flagged revisions, right? The different names at different times. So flagged revisions, meaning that the edit takes, but it's not shown publicly, right, until someone comes by and marks that flagged revision as okay. So that's a different approach to the not every IP gets to show their stuff right away or at all in Wikipedias. And I guess that's one of the challenges, very hard to relate experiences from one Wikipedia edition to another. As Richard said, in English Wikipedia, we're just like, we have so many admins and so many people policing vandalism, we can afford to have a very inefficient and messy system of allowing IPs to edit. And we also have Cluebot NG, which automatically undoes like 80% of all vandalism. And I believe Portuguese did not have that. And there was no bot operator to do that. So I think that was a major factor, because I remember dialoguing with them the week before they turned it on. I said, did you guys try this? Did you guys try that? Because it kind of seems a shame to turn on no IP editing without trying these things. But they didn't have the what they call it, the spare labor to run bots to do vandalism detection. Whereas English Wikipedia, we have kind of a multi-bot, multi-tool, multi-volunteer effort to fight vandalism, and that's not always available. So,
yeah, and I think how Bill hinted on the potential as well, because even if Portuguese Wikipedia isn't one of the largest ones yet, they are the 6th largest language by terms of native speakers. So the potential is huge.
Right. And we'd love to hear other experiences from folks watching there, whether you're from Portuguese Wikipedia or from other languages. Tell us about your experiences in vandalism or IP editing, because they're all very different. And I think most people know that Japanese Wikipedia is like majority IP editors, but they're all pretty much not all, but mostly well-behaved. And it's not a culture to create accounts in Japanese internet platforms. So it's weird. You can't just take one set of rules and map them to all these different editions like that. All right, so let's go back to our countdown. What do we have here? We have Abstract Wikipedia. And Richard, you've been following this because Abstract Wikipedia started on Wikispore, which you...
to some extent. Yeah. So Abstract. So we should review Abstract Wikipedia. So Abstract Wikipedia, I guess it's started as a project by Denny, who was formerly a board member of the Wikimedia Foundation, who started the Wikidata project several years ago, and who has recently been working for Google as a sort of Wikimedian in residence. but has come back to the foundation to work for the foundation for this project. The idea was, I think, it was called Wiki Lambda for a while, and that's the wiki of functions, which is sort of a library of like, you know, computing functions. And I'm not a computer science person, but someone can help fill me in here. And the idea was to, you know, with this sort of library of different functions, to be able to represent in a more language-based way a Wikipedia article in different languages that could be called abstract Wikipedia. And I should mention Wiki Functions is the name that was recently determined by a contest, which was kind of nice that they were able to vote on and have a contest. So that was positive. Yeah, it's the first new Wikimedia project since 2012, 2013, when the Wikidata and Wikivoyage were launched at the same time. Wikivoyage being adopted from the German language community that sort of split off from Wikitravel. I think it has a lot of potential. It can, you know, approach things in a more narrative way, in a more literary way that Wikidata cannot. It also has some dangers. There's a high danger of sort of cultural centralism, which is inherent in any project like this. Does this mean that, that we have like one Wikipedia that works for one Wikipedia narrative from like English Wikipedia that works for all the languages? Hopefully that's not what it means. And what measures can we make to ensure that doesn't happen, and that we have, it's more of an infrastructure than a command and control. Perhaps Vera, or someone else want to share more about the technical basis, if you could.
Well, the lexeme part of Wikidata is probably very vital for this. I know Lucas Werkmeister has been working hard on that part. The lexeme portion of Wikidata is sort of the successor. What's probably going to be the successor to Wiki Dictionary, where you describe the meaning of words and how what sort of concept they define. And the marvelous thing about abstract Wikipedia is that in theory we're going to be far better at supporting smaller languages by creating articles that by abstractly describing a concept that then can be translated, sort of have a machine translation across all language versions, which is quite neat. In theory, that's a way of supporting even the smallest languages in the world, as long as you've got those languages defined properly. And it's a great way to generate a lot of stubs as well. And that way you already have something that might not exactly be grammatical. So, yeah, because language is weird, still have a grammatical error every now and then, because we would know that heads are a word that only applies to humans and horses in Dutch, and then all the other animals have a different word for head.
Yeah, it's basically, if you can symbolically express something like this, the example on the screen, then you can automatically generate the sentence in different languages, right? Which is pretty cool. But there was some concern about how fast this got pushed through, right?
Well, I'm not really concerned, because I love the project idea, but it was really quick, because then he published a draft on Meta. He started writing it on 4th of May, and the approval from the Board of Trustees was the 22nd of May. So that's like 3 weeks less than from starting the draft to the approval from the board. That's pretty quick.
We're rebels on the internet. We're just all anarchists.
Yeah. So I do hope. I mean, it was quick this time. I hope it's quicker in the future. I have my own pet project called Wikispore. We played with hosting part of it there, and the idea of that is to provide a an experimental ground where people can try out new projects. So hopefully it doesn't have to be, Denny's project came with, many years of technical work, and it had to get a big, I think it has some big funding that was required. So the idea is to maybe make it a little bit easier to launch, smaller scale, more experimental projects. And I hope that can be part of this going forward. So it doesn't take another 10 years to launch the next Wikimedia project.
Well, you want it faster than 3 weeks from draft to board approval? That's pretty impressive.
Well, no, I don't want it. Well, I mean, it's, Denny's very established, has a lot of, experience and connections. But I mean, I want it to be, most of the proposals have been sitting there for 10 or 15 years, and they haven't had a clear response from anyone. And the idea is to, make it a little bit easier to have something a little bit like a wiki farm where you can sort of play with ideas and experiment with technology in a little bit looser way.
Yeah, I think if this had come from somebody other than the guy who created Wikidata, it would have been ushered through quite so quickly.
Yeah, I mean, he had a great track record, and that's great, but it doesn't work for everyone.
and he also has been working on and publishing papers about this specific idea for a number of years, 3 to 5 years. So
that's true as well.
He was at the first Wikimania in 2005 in Frankfurt talking about the beginnings of this. So that's how far back it goes. So you're right. Like, this is probably the one thing you can kind of cover your eyes on when it comes to fast tracking something through the board and say, the guy who created Wikidata, which is accounts for the most edits in our entire movement right now, he's got some clout in this area, right? But you'd like to see, with this thing as the exception, a better path for other projects to move through in some way that we really don't have a great process for doing right now, right?
Well, and this is the abstract Wikipedia and Wikidata already. It's greenfield. It is a possibility to kind of take the community, go in new directions. The old Wikipedia, the hidebound, dare I say conservative, curmudgeonly encyclopedia, might not be the most important part of the project in 10 years' time. And you can start to see how that's the case with Wikidata and abstract Wikipedia being more useful to other researchers and programmers. Its applications in AI are not lost on too many who follow it. So yeah, I think it's hard to see from here for most people how Wikipedia itself becomes the old hat. I'm excited to see where it goes.
Yeah, I might ask Netha, have you thought about how something like abstract Wikipedia might make sense for scientific and medical information in different languages?
Well, when it comes to scientific information, I think that we should be more careful in describing the disease conditions or the survival rates and so forth. So it could be a little bit hard with abstract Wikipedia, where you can generate text from abstract concepts. So I don't know how it really works, but I'm really looking forward to experimenting many different things, and we never know how the project will turn out in maybe 5-10 years. And at the same time, I think that for small language Wikipedias to write about places and people, it would be very beneficial, because then the volunteers do not have to spend a lot of time, put a lot of time in repeating the same sentences over and over again.
Right. Great. Let's go to number 4, structured data on commons. So this is now, what structured on commons might be 2 to 3 years old now, I guess, for most folks. But this year really turned a corner, and that structured data on commons now has a query service. So the same way that you can go to query.wikidata.org for Wikidata, you now have a very convoluted URL for the other one. So while you folks talk, I'm going to bring up the screen. So what do your folks think about where structured data on commons is right now in 2020?
Well, it's also great that there are bots on Wikimedia Commons that put data in structured form. Being able to get a list of Flickr photos that are already on Wikimedia Commons in a structured form is far easier than getting that sort of data out of the MediaWiki API. So that's helpful for when you've got a account on Flickr from which you want to know which photographs aren't yet on Wikimedia Commons and the like. That now requires just way less processing and homebrewing some codes and stuff than it used to. And it's mainly made possible because there are also bots on Wikimedia Commons that put that data that was in wiki text in structured form. So Hi Kramer has done a lot of that sort of work, if I'm not mistaken. So it's always nice.
But it's really like now you're showing a query here, and it's really giving you an opportunity finding media in a new way, because now you can actually search for all kinds of stuff. You can combine a query like, I want this specific license and I want it in this area of the world. I want the photo to be taken and stuff like that, which you couldn't really do in the regular search before. So that's it's a strong promise for findability.
Yes. Yes, very much so.
I'm very happy about the query service because in that way I can generate medical images that are exactly relevant to like the subject I'm writing about. So when I created an educational resource for medical students to learn medicine, so I wanted to direct them only to the correct images. And if they do a Google search, for example, or do a common search, they would get just about any other image and they would be confused because because these images are so alike each other, and I want them to be able to say the difference between, say, clear cell carcinoma and other types of carcinoma, for example. So a possibility of, having, for being able to search only for those specific images and not see anything else as suggestions, I think is a great resource for the whole movement.
Right, and this ability to kind of search commons, but then kind of correlate it to Wikidata, that's what we call federated search on these, what they call RDF databases, which is really powerful, right? It means that you don't need to have all the data in one database. You can kind of say, I want to look at files that have this property in commons, but then are related to this thing in Wikidata, and maybe this thing at that museum and this thing at this other museum. And that's really powerful. And we haven't really even begun to tap all that potential yet. There are right now some sample queries that do that. So we're still figuring it out. And I think the most important thing right now is that structured data on commons gives us the mechanism to do these things, but it doesn't necessarily give us any kind of policy, right? The community has to come up with how to model paintings for artworks or for genomes and all these things. And that's actually not easy. So to try to come up with agreement on how to model things correctly in Wikidata and Commons is going to be the challenge going forward. And it's pretty cool that we have this function now. But as you can see from the unwieldy domain name, I can never remember it. So wcqs-beta.wmflabs.org. That's the thing. And I'm always typing the WMQS or WM something. And I cannot get it in my brain. Anyway, so write that down somewhere, play with it. It's really cool, the things you can do with it. And finally, Commons is not going to be completely English centric. We can start to use statements to do this stuff and not just English language categories. All right, so that is structured data on Commons. And our next thing in our list is Wikimedia strategy. Wow, this is a lot of stuff to handle. So this is Wikimedia 2030 strategy was done. It's been finished. And now we're in the transition phase. So yes, Vera, where do you think we are now? What are the things we've been doing in the Dutch community around this? I've
been to meetups discussing this, but I'm not the best participant in this. I'm not all that big on planning ahead myself, but it's nice that other people do this.
Well, we're in the transition phase now, right? So that's the label for where we are right now. And how about other folks? What are the things that you've been talking about related to this?
So I've been involved a little bit in the planning for Wikimedia Sweden upcoming work, and we've been paying close attention to the recommendations. So I hope that most of the affiliates will do the same way, really take a look at, because there's a lot of thought going into it. And you can only hope that also funding will depend on you being aligned with it, because otherwise it's sort of wasted. So yeah, it's a good framework, but of course it don't really tell you exactly what to do, so you have a lot of freedom still.
Right.
And I hope it's not too dependent on. I hope your funding isn't too dependent on being aligned with one central program. I mean, I could see, you should try to, especially like, the important parts, the parts that are, expanding the movement, promoting diversity, things like that. I mean, obviously there will be some divergences of opinion around the world how different affiliates choose to engage with it.
You should be aligned. You shouldn't work like in the opposite direction.
Yes, you shouldn't work in the opposite direction. Yes, that's fair. There are a lot of initiatives. So Andrew has helpfully sorted some of the 45. It's one of the recent activities has been to try to prioritize them. So the idea of like, which one should we pursue in the next 6 months? Which one should we maybe pursue after that? And there's been a lot of, a little bit unsureness around that process, and also the process about, we decide that this is a good thing, but like say we decide, I don't know, any particular initiative is a good initiative, but what does that mean? What does that mean that we should pursue in that area, and how do we decide that? And that part has not been terribly clear. How do we make decisions on what to actually do about this stuff? Whether it's supporting more languages or getting hubs together of different regions or thematic areas around the world. That the decision-making process has not been so clear.
And during the fall, the Wikimedia Foundation held a number of meetings, global conversations, where we were discussing which ones of these do we need to coordinate globally on, and on the opposite, which ones can any affiliate start acting on locally and just apply it.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that is kind of tough about this list is that there's a lot to digest, right? So this is the list published by the team. This is actually a summary, which is still 45 items clustered into 10 groups there. And as Richard said, I tried to put them into this grid here, which I'm glad the strategy team has took and gone further with it, which is great. So if you haven't been engaged with the strategy so far, this is the best page to start with, and maybe this one grid here. The thing that is probably the most pressing and the thing that needs to be done right away is number 22 and 23 on the screen here. A movement charter and interim global council. Those are kind of like prerequisites to anything that happens beyond January or February of next year. So does anyone want to speak to what those are? Movement charter, interim global council, and some of the challenges there? Or is it too scary and unknown? Richard, you were the progenitor of the earlier Chapters Association, so this is the only thing that resembles that, right?
Yes, I wasn't the progenitor. I was in the room.
Guilty, by the way.
I tried to learn from that experience. I guess the main thing I got from that experience is that it was way too oriented around money. It was there was a discussions about what should be the membership fees of the Chapters Association, and we have to set up international secretariat in Geneva, and what will Wikimedia Deutschland and Wikimedia UK and all the other chapters pay for it, and so that was I prefer a more grassroots approach, and I hope we're going a little bit more in that direction now, and I hope we can take that with things like the Global Council and thinking about the movement charter. I think the movement charter should think of like what applies to everyone in the movement. So like, how should the Wikimedia affiliates conduct themselves? How should the Wikimedia Foundation conduct themselves? What's good governance? What are good procedures of consultation? What are the principles that we want to honor? How do we use free and open source software? When is it entirely necessary to use it? When is it helpful to be pragmatic and use some other software? To sort of come to a consensus about the broad philosophical things of how the movement should go, and I hope that is a grassroots community driven process. I hope we can come up with a document that, like a good Wikipedia article 80% of people can agree is the way to go forward. I hope that's the process. More, I mean, there are different paths to reaching that process, and it won't, be the same way to writing a Wikipedia article. But I hope we can end up with that result that 80% of people can agree. This is what our movement charter should be. This is what the responsibilities and the duties of the different actors are, and the rights, and things like that, and the direction should be going in.
I just want to say I'm glad this is Wikimedia 2030 and not 2025, because there's at least 10 years worth of work in this list.
Yeah, it's going to be hairy. One of the things that is tough about this is, as written, it says the same committee that drafts the movement charter is going to serve as the interim global council, and that might be a real bug in the system, in that a group that drafts the charter for the entire movement is not necessarily the same type or right body to govern for the first time in our movement. So right now it is one in the same. Now there are ways to separate those in some sense. You can have a committee of the global council that does the drafting, but this is asking for a big lift and a lot of time from people. And some of the discussions have had the issue of whether some of these folks might be paid. Otherwise, you're just going to get people of privilege who can serve this role, and that's it. And how are you going to get a movement charter or a global council that's truly representative of the world and our community if only the privileged can have the spare time or the effort to participate in this thing? So I don't know what the answer is. I don't know if anyone else has any answers or comments on that. How do we get a good representative slice of our community for this?
Now, I think one of the questions is the timeline. How long is this going to take? If it's rushed, then I think that might be a problem. If it's, we try to do everything in the first 6 months of 2021 as the pandemic is still raging, how many committees can we convene? How many documents can we write in a short time period? And, you might want to think of a more stepped approach for some of these things. And then also think about, how to support people, who might need some support to help participate on the committee as well. I think that's very valid.
Yeah, and if people watching or listening, let us know in the comments or on the talk pages. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, but not a lot of ideas so far. I think a lot of iteration needs to be done here, but we don't have more than a few ideas out there so far. But it's a really hard problem. I don't envy the task ahead for the folks who are working on this. So let's go to our next item, which should be. Let's see. Wikimania canceled an all in-person conferences, which we kind of touched on number 10. But thoughts from folks about us going all virtual in 2020?
Well, it's also quite fun to join meetups you wouldn't otherwise be able to go to because they're abroad. I myself have actually become a member of the New York City chapter during this quarantine because time and place doesn't matter. I've also joined meetups in London from the British chapter. So it's a new way to meet people, and like I said before on the stream, here in the Netherlands we've been able to establish a more permanent link with the Dutch Caribbean islands. That was also made possible because we already had a small group of Dutch Wikipedians go over there last year, but now they were also able to join us during the Christmas reception that was held via Zoom. And I also participated in the hackathon that was online this year instead of somewhere in Europe. And it also had a lot more participants from regions that usually can't send people all the way to Europe. and I myself still had felt like I had really participated in a hackathon, so that was still nice to have been organized this year. Yeah, and of course the Wikicon North America, which I've also joined part of the live stream of. Andrew was a big player in getting that off the ground. So maybe
Richard and I helped plan that, but it was only because we saw so many folks do so many amazing things throughout 2020, and I wanted to point to this page, which was created right when all these conferences were being canceled. And I think the first one in our movement was the hackathon, right? I think that was planned to be in person in Albania.
Albania, Tirana, I think.
Yeah, and I was planning to go, and it got canceled, and then we said, let's do something online. So it was the first of our in-person conferences in the movement that we had to try to do fully online, and we created this page to start documenting some of those experiments. So feel free to take a look at this and see the different things that we kind of tested, and just kind of put down all the different tools that people tried, which is really cool just to see the document of what different things people were using over time. Jan, you were involved with a lot of different conferences over this time too, right?
Yeah, and I was really inspired by how many organizers managed to adapt and do something great online. I participated in many, and most of them were really fun to join. I think technically, perhaps with the Wikimedia Summit was the first to get canceled, and that one didn't get an online version.
Right. Yeah, that's true. I should have qualified that as something was canceled, but they still wanted to do something. Wikimedia Summit was just kind of pushed off and then refactored into something else, maybe.
Yeah, I think the first idea was to have a series of online meetings, but that actually got changed during the planning.
Right, and then that also led to the establishment of at least two new services, right, Richard, on WM Cloud?
Yeah, so we, with the technical bravura of Amir Sarabdani, Wikimedia Meet and Wikimedia Chat. Wikimedia Meet is a Jitsi instance, so you can host a video conference on any topic. It's sort of like Zoom, but free and open source, and it creates a continuous room, and you can tie it to your Wikimedia account. Actually, I'm not sure if you can tie it officially yet, but you will eventually. And Wikimedia Chat, which is based on Mattermost, which is a sort of something a little bit like Slack, a little bit more modern than IRC. And they're both available to be used and to be generative with, and they're both still a bit experimental. I know there was a bug recently with with Wikimedia Meet, but that's being fixed, and hopefully it'll work better than ever. And and Wikimedia Chat is also available for all sorts of different uses if you want to have a particular use in mind. If you want to play with conference or different thematic stuff there, and hopefully we can have more tools like this as time goes on. We recognize the usefulness of meeting virtually. As I think we should have some in-person stuff as well in the future, but hopefully they can work in sync. And I had an idea for the Wikimedia Social Suite, which is that we'd have this suite of programs where people can connect socially online using our services, and hopefully people can contribute their own ideas in that direction.
Yeah, and it's great to see some folks in the chat just chiming in on some of their more interesting conferences that were virtual this year. MCN, which is the Museum Computer Network Virtual 2020, was done, I think, over 2 weeks. They had basically, it used to be 3 days or 4 days, and they spread it over 2 weeks, 4 hours a day or something like that. It was actually kind of interesting. I did a Wikidata tutorial for them. We also have some folks pointing out that we have some other pages on our wiki telling us where we can look for resources. And Cooper Hewitt, sponsored something too. So a lot of interesting things happening. And as folks have said, it kind of weirdly allowed for a wider inclusion over a lot of these events, where a lot of these conferences, we would say, okay, we're going to spend 80-90% of our time on the in-person thing. If we have some extra resources, we'll stream the video here or do some online stuff. And it was kind of cool saying if you do it virtual first, it really allows for a wider range of folks to participate from all over.
Also, I will point out that at least at WikiConference North America, this year we had virtually only lightning talks. So we had no program committee to speak of. If we had a really bad submission, we would have rejected it, but we didn't get a really bad submission. So we accepted everything, and it worked pretty well. So, there's something to be said for just, more open, more informal things and less curating in some shorter sessions.
Yeah, and then I think a lot of people played around with these kind of virtual room software options, like what's that Town one that people have been using for a while?
Gather Town.
Right, Gather Town. So your little avatar, almost like an 8-bit Nintendo game, and you walk around and you can video conference with other people. For WikiConference North America, we used a tool that was recommended by the Italian Wikimedians, which was Wonder Me, which is kind of cool. Little bugs here and there, but it was really neat to have people just wander around doing hallway conversations like at a conference.
Yeah, what was the hackathon we were using? The Remo?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, a Remoco. I think so this is something else that should be a Wikipedia article, which is spatialized chat discussions, spatialized video discussions. There are a few different ones. There's also another one called Spatial Chat, which people have used for karaoke. Not for Wikimedia purposes, for general karaoke, although I'm sure it's adaptable. I think that's another emergent area of software that someone might want to work on the article for.
Yeah.
I love Butch's idea. We should make a highlight reel of all of our online conferences in some way, just to see the variety of what we did.
It needs to be a highlight, because if you're going to add everyone to the playlist, it's going to be a long playlist.
Yeah, we don't even have them documented well on our not Crow page, the remote collaboration page. So we actually should do a pretty good authoritative list here if we can on the remote event participation. We're kind of not documenting our history very well if we don't do that. Great. So any other words on remote conferences? Maybe useful to tell folks that it's unlikely Wikimania is going to happen in 2021 in real life. That's probably not a surprise to people, considering no one can really fly into Thailand unless you quarantine for 2 weeks in a hotel. So I guess we could do all the same hotel, quarantine the same hotel and do Wikimania there, but that would be kind of pointless. So
yeah, immediately create a bubble of
at Disney World. Just like the NBA, we'll have a bubble at Disney World.
Bubble Wikimania. But why would we all fly to one place to do that? I guess.
Yeah, no, I'm kidding.
Yeah, but you're right. But Jan, I mean, you're part of the sustainability group, right? So this has been an interesting time for sustainability folks to see these things happen, right?
It has been, but unfortunately, it's not really in the plans for the Wikimedia Foundation to continue this. So you would hope that we learn from this and actually take this to our heart and do more of this, not because that we have to, but because that will actually enable us to collaborate on scale in a bit of a new way. Like we have been trying all these tools for many years, but not as intense as during this year.
Right.
I'm personally a fan of local meetups and things like picnics, and so which are pretty light on the environment. So I hope we can have a hybrid of online connections and local events as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I want a great worldwide network picnic. We've had them in the US, but maybe we can go global.
The local meetups, they were really good place to do outreach. So there would be a lot of people from outside the movement who come there to learn about how the movement works, and then they eventually become Wikimedians. So now, because we don't have them, some communities in India, they have tried doing like online events where they where they send out like public invites for people to join. But we haven't had such good responses yet. So I think maybe with time, people will be more and more comfortable joining online local meetups as well, and we can have the same kind of new Wikimedians coming in through online meetups rather than the offline versions.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. That it's there's no one size fits all formula, right? For some emerging communities, it's really important to have that face-to-face interaction, right? We had this debate recently on a Telegram group where folks kind of said, oh, well, GLAM would have happened regardless. And I said, I don't think so. We really needed that face-to-face interaction with curators and librarians saying, oh, these Wikimedians aren't just these weird people sitting in basements typing all the time. They're actually human beings you can have a conversation with. And oh, there's a university professor. Oh, and there's a librarian. And it makes a difference to have face-to-face.
Fun fact. So my first engagement with the GLAM world was in, I think, was it 2007, maybe early 2008, when we had we scheduled a giant wiki ramble in Brooklyn, New York, my hometown, and we went from the local library to the Botanic Garden to the Brooklyn Museum. And just by a couple of Wikimedians walking around the museum, in the front of the museum, someone was fixing the computers in the front of the museum. Shelley Bernstein, who was the tech head there, and that's how we got our first connection for the first Wiki Loves event. It was by just having a regular, social meetup of Wikimedians walking around and just running into the local tech person, who has done a lot of great stuff since then, and we were able to hook up through the Brooklyn Museum to the Metropolitan Museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum in the UK, and that was the first Wiki Loves event, and it came from just a social meetup. It didn't require any international flights, but it did require some local sociality. So hopefully we can have some more of those generative events that are accidental.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Witty Llama here does point out that there are allowances for in-person events, but there are some guidelines around them, right? So there is some risk assessment checklists when you apply for grants and things like that. So it's important to know that there are guidelines from the foundation for those things.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah,
So
New Zealand was able to kick COVID out of its country before the WMF was able to get this protocol together. So good on them.
Right, New Zealand being certainly literally an edge case, like on the edge of the world out there. So that's a interesting first community that has done the in-person meetups there. All right, so before we hit number one, because I'm kind of surprised if anyone who's been a regular watcher of this thinks there's a mystery around number one, but we also want to highlight some interesting stories that didn't quite fit some of the themes that we had here per se. But one is certainly the impact of, at least in the US, but globally, of Black Lives Matter, the death of George Floyd, and a topic like Juneteenth, which actually was the number one article in English Wikipedia for multiple days at a time, when a lot of even people in the US don't even know what this is. So, Richard, you had some great observations around this, like how these affect.
Yeah,
communities.
I thought, I thought Black Lives Matter and BLM was a huge topic on Wikipedia, particularly English Wikipedia, which is what I most observed this year. It's a very encyclopedic topic. There are a lot of new articles created, a lot of articles modified. So if you look at, the history of, police brutality in the past, but also like just the history of, say, slavery, and looking at, every historic personages and their connection to the institution of slavery in the U.S. and broader. There was a lot of Colston in the UK, you'll see, was one of the people on the month in June. A lot of new articles were created. A lot of articles were changed. A lot of articles had their names changed because people have been moving beyond offensive names or names with other issues. And you'll see like there are huge areas where things in the US and the UK and in India and outside the English-speaking world as well have been renamed and changed. And so it's been a very encyclopedic phenomenon in a lot of ways, because there's been a lot of content changed and a lot of reassessing both of current and recent history, as well as farther back history, going back to the first colonialist impulses. So it's been interesting to see that, and to see addressing this area, but also like how much farther we have to go in terms of fixing it on English Wikipedia and beyond. There's still a lot of lack in this area. There was a Black Lives Matter wiki project started in English Wikipedia, but still a lot of these areas are very undercovered. Could use a lot more support, and grateful to see folks like the Afro Crowd user group and the Black Lunch Table user group and others that have helped address some of these issues. But there's still a ways to go to improve a lot of these articles, and they are very. I mean, it's just. I thought it was important, including especially because it is very focused on the encyclopedia. It's a there are a lot of topics. It wasn't just like one or two articles that it affected. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, then Black Lives Matter had a huge global impact, right? If you look at the catalog of impacts of George Floyd protests, they were like statues pulled down all over the world. There are all kinds of things that were sparked globally from this one thing. And the graphic that we showed before was quite fascinating because this was a story put out by Quartz, the publication Quartz, and they did a pretty cool thing saying, what's the top article for every day of every year of every day in 2020 for Wikipedia English. And you can see for June, it was either the killing of George Floyd or the killing of another black man in the United States or Juneteenth. And then Netta, this is interesting. The other story that popped through was from India. And that was a big story in India, right? In terms of the death of an actor.
There were so many speculations around the death of this actor, and he was quite popular in India also. So, yeah. So, and I think that a large user base. Wikipedia has a lot of readers in India, of course, because India has larger population, and many more people are like coming to the internet using their mobile devices. So we have many new users discovering internet for the first time on India, and they subsequently go to Wikipedia to look for information they want to know about the celebrities. So I think it's not surprising that we see we see Wikipedia articles that are important for Indian people showing up in the top viewed article list, because there are so many people there who are seeking information on Wikipedia from India.
And if you look at this list, also you'll see names like Edward Colston, who was a slave trader who was significant in the UK. Quite a few, I think a statue was pulled down. A lot of things were renamed. You'll see Marsha P. Johnson, a leading trans activist of I think the 60s and the 70s in New York. So there's quite a bit of readership, and hopefully we can encourage some more editorship on these topics, particularly in that month, but throughout the year.
Yes, and the foundation just put out, I think yesterday or the day before, their list of top 10 articles in English Wikipedia this past year, and the majority of those are COVID or George Floyd and BLM related articles. So that's also another list worth looking at. So yeah, it's an interesting time to see these top 10 topics because they all punch through with these same themes. The other story we want to highlight, oh my, a big facepalm, is Scott's Wikipedia. Who can explain what happened with Scott's Wikipedia?
Poor Scots Wikipedia. Well, there was this. Scots is a language that is sort of mutually understandable to English speakers, but because it doesn't have an army, it has had some struggle to get recognition. And of course, it's not a language that has many speakers anymore because of the dominance of English. And this past year, it has come to light that there was an American who hadn't actually mastered the Scots language, who had been creating a lot of articles on the Scots language Wikipedia that had some select words just replaced with Scots words, which is not how you do translation. And a problem created out of good intentions has resulted in a lot of articles that are even better readable to native English speakers because they practically are English language Wikipedia articles with just a select few words replaced. So that doesn't help with the credibility of the Scots language, unfortunately. The user that was involved in the creation of these articles has since come to, it's very unfortunate for him as well because he wasn't really aware of what sort of impact the work he was doing was
Every
having.
indication was it was good faith, right? He was thought he was trying to do a good job, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I think Liam shares here, a language is a dialect with an army and a navy, which is a famous proverb. It's not actually, we actually have a Wikipedia article on this saying. It's not clear where it comes from. It might have come from Yiddish, which is a famous language that didn't have an army or navy. This is an issue that affects more languages than you might think. In terms of languages that don't have a clear standard or clear written standard, even Scots, even though it's spoken in a very wealthy established country, doesn't quite have an established written standard. There are like a variety of different standards, and some publications use some and some use others. And also, I mean, especially a lot of languages on Wikipedia are written by dominantly non-native speakers. So people like language enthusiasts, Wikipedia is like catnip to polyglots. A lot of people, if they're working on some Creole language or some language that they want to just learn about their newest Romance language conquest, they want to share. So even I've actually experienced this in New York. In using the original language without an army and a navy, Yiddish, we've had some disagreements in apparently about the Yiddish speaking community, because the Yiddish Wikipedia is written mostly in academic style Yiddish, which is sort of reflects a more northern dialect and also an older dialect, and the one that's taught in colleges. But the majority of people who speak the language vernacularly today use a more southern dialect and something with probably more English and more Hebrew. And actually, I think they also got rid of gender. So yeah, I'm a little bit in the place where this is the language of my grandparents, my great grandparents, in the way that a lot of Scots is the language of their grandparents and their great grandparents. So I see that angle as well, and I've gotten some curious reactions when I've just asked people like on the street about what they think about Yiddish Wikipedia, and they said, "Oh, that's kind of written kind of funny." So I think this is a spectrum that exists across many Wikipedias. Scots was quite at a far end of it for a good faith effort, but it's also we should be careful about other languages as well, which might be written by a lot of non-native speakers.
Yeah, we had some of those. No, go ahead.
Speaking of popular, thinking about the Eric Raymond quote that with enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. And the problem here are other eyeballs for a number of years.
2 eyeballs.
And in many ways, like 2 eyeballs, basically. Like Wikipedia is extremely good. All the projects are extremely good. There's a lot of participation. Then they can deal with the externalities of arguments. But when there's no one even around to argue, you have these inexperienced but enthusiastic amateurs who fill the gap completely, or with a lot of other small, like very small language Wikipedias, like I think, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is one of those that is written almost. And about a month after the Scots Wikipedia controversy, there was a smaller one involving the Malagasy. Again, not a word I had to pronounce out loud, but the official language of Madagascar. This one was written by a bot and apparently rather badly. So a cleanup effort was undertaken, and I think that Wikipedia edition was reduced by more than a third. So I don't know what the way out of this is. I think trying to encourage more people to join the movement is the answer. I don't know that that'll really be solved.
Well, this story coming up in the news did recruit some new editors to the Scots language Wikipedia. But there's work like this takes a lot of work again to mend, because it's not as easy as just removing all the articles this one editor has created, because then you're probably also throwing away work that has been put on top of the work this one individual did. So unweaving Wikipedia contributions can be a lot of work, which sometimes pops up, usually with copyright infringements. But
this was like the supreme example of Cunningham's law in action. So the Cunningham's law was the best way to get the right answer is to post the wrong answer, and this was the wrong answer, and it got attention on Reddit, right? So the problem is in the Scots group on Reddit, someone said, "What is with the Scots Wikipedia? What's going on?" And it was so embarrassing that we shut it down, and other people came in to try to fix it. So now we have I don't know about active community. We have people trying to do it for real. So maybe this has got a silver lining to the whole story there. So.
I checked. I got curious. I went and looked at the Scott Wikipedia. It's fewer than a dozen edits per day, and sometimes as many as 3 dozen edits per day.
Not bad.
But compared to other editions, but compared to where it was, it's better.
Yeah. Hopefully the Scots language community forgives us and accepts this wayward child.
All right. So are we ready to reveal number 1 on our list? Which should be no surprise to folks who are watching the community. But it is Wikimedia brand project paused after community feedback. So folks might not have seen this, the few of you. The Wikimedia Foundation has been for over 2 years, it might be 3 years at this point, looking into ways to reconfigure the brand. And one of the major thrusts was whether the movement and the foundation should be called Wikipedia. So whether it's Wikipedia Foundation or the Wikipedia movement, which has certainly been fairly spirited in terms of the conversations around this. So what's a good way to describe where we are now with the situation?
I guess.
Well, it's on
pause. It's on pause. So there was, so unfortunately, it seems like the initial way it was designed was that we want to change it from this name to that name, and we want to engage people about how we make this particular change rather than asking them if we should make this particular change. It was a bit assumed. And because that was a bit assumed, there was some pushback from the community. There was a request for comment that got a lot of discussion informally. At a certain point, some of the affiliates and some individuals made an open letter, which I was a part of, called the Community Open Letter on Renaming, sort of objecting to the process per se, and the lack of community consultation. So there were about 70 or so affiliates that signed on, almost 1,000 individuals signed on. And there was, the step from the Wikimedia Foundation board where they said, okay, so, we're gonna make a pause on this. They committed to pausing until March 1st, 2021. And hopefully there will be more community consultation. I think there are actually also steps in between, Wikipedia Foundation and what we have now that might be useful in terms of fundraising and publicity that perhaps haven't been fully thought out. And I sort of wish that the community engaged in depth a little bit before this. I think unfortunately, the way there were some sessions that were in-person sessions when people were flying around the world, in Oslo and I think Bangalore, maybe someplace else, where there were some exercises done, but they didn't really get to the core questions. And I heard that as feedback from some of the people who participated in them. They didn't get quite to the core questions of what our brand means and how we should pursue them.
Well, they also had one online, and I participated in that one. And it sort of went into the core question, but then it sort of got skipped ahead a large between the next step where they presented these alternatives, because that was not even in the exercises. So yeah, it was a little bit of a disconnected process. That's how it appeared to me.
Yeah, I think the go ahead, sorry.
I think this is actually going to come up in March, the way that it has been. Like it was shelved till March 2021. Do we think something will actually happen then, or will it be pushed out again? And does this really have any chance of actually happening at this point?
That's a good question. I think there's still a strong will by the foundation staff, at least, to do this. And I think the best slide that kind of encapsulates how bad a disconnect there is here was the data that was available even before we had this community survey. And this is the one thing I put together that shows this. So before they had the survey that went out to everyone, There was a 92% oppose on a RFC. Now, of course, we know that RFCs are not necessarily a measure of community sentiment. Who even knows it's there? Is there fair notice that everyone should be participating here? But it should speak volumes that 92% of people who responded to the answer or to the question, should the foundation call itself Wikipedia? There's a 92% oppose. That should speak volumes as to what a pretty significant chunk of the community thinks. Now, compare that to the research the foundation did, the brand team, where they asked for people to send in emails or look for responses on the talk page and interviewed people. And I was one of those people they interviewed, where they claimed only 0.6% of people opposed this. Now, first of all, as any good researcher, Netta, you're a PhD, or you're a doctor, PhD, when you see a number under 1%, any person with any research chop should say the experiment has failed in some way. There's something wrong with this experiment. And the reason why is because they compared, the numerator was how many people opposed it, and then the denominator, the bottom, they divide by how many people they thought knew about this, right? That is terrible methodology, right? You don't compare responses versus, I think this many people knew of the survey. That's just completely wrong in terms of methodology, but that is what was put forth. That's how we got the 0.6%. 92%, 0.6%. That doesn't make sense. At this point, they should have paused the whole thing and said, we need to reevaluate where this has gone. They didn't. They just went ahead and went with the survey with all the options being Wikipedia, 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 Wikipedia. And that's where I think the big problem came up between the community and the foundation. So at least we have this pause, but required a grassroots letter signed by 70 some affiliates and 950 people to get the foundation to pause this. That is good that it got that reaction, but it still doesn't solve this problem of a massive disconnect, as Jan said, between the two sides here. So that, I don't know where we go from here other than there is kind of a road to reconciliation, and there's a committee being formed to try to steer the process after March. Is it March of next year, Richard? Yeah.
Yeah, it's starting March 1st.
Yeah. So there was a board resolution saying it's paused till March, but there's no guarantees after March whether we're going to recover from this 92% versus 0.6% disconnect. Any thoughts? Like, is there some optimism here that we can get beyond this? It's hard.
And I think we have to get the 80% solution. And we have to get a solution that 80% of people are comfortable with. And I will accept nothing less than total compromise. I'm unyielding.
Well, anyway, this obviously because there was such a big gulf, this caused for a lot of conversation and debate in the community, and that's why we put it as kind of the number one thing. And it wasn't just us; it was ranked up there in our Wikipedia Weekly Facebook poll, and people put it up there because there's so much passion around this, especially when it comes to a brand that people thought they donated their time to, and then suddenly to see it maybe being the main brand being used for fundraising for things that are not just Wikipedia. You know, we have Commons, we have Wikidata, we have Source, we got all different types of things happening here. So, you know, the Wikimedia brand is part of the community identity. And before you play with that identity, you really need to understand what the sentiment is in the community. Okay, so we actually had some other things here, not just number one, but we actually had something we want to talk about here about the new affiliates. I did not realize there were this many new affiliates. So Richard, tell us about some of these folks that we have as new affiliates for 2020.
Okay, I will try to tell you about as many of them as I can. Les Sans Pages is a counterpart to Women in Red, I believe, in the French language, a francophone project focusing on gender issues and other underrepresented topics. Wikimedia user groups of Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm sorry, I mispronounced the Maori name of New Zealand, but obviously representing the most successful region in the world in terms of the current crisis. Wiki Cemeteries user group. The idea is to, there are a lot of genealogists in our community, a lot of people interested in history, and cemeteries are a nice way to explore that. And hopefully we'll have more events connected to cemeteries and local history. Wikimedians of the United Arab Emirates user group, which actually we have perhaps a friend from there joining us right now in this call. So welcome, Teaching. Thanks for joining the podcast.
You skipped one.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I did. I was about to go back to it. Myanmar Wikimedia Community User Group from Myanmar. Community User Group C Spring for the Central and Eastern European group, quite an active regional subgroup for Central and Eastern Europe. Wiki Grannies, which are I think grandmothers and maybe other folks, in I think maybe different language communities. Wikimedians for Sustainable Development, which Jan, I believe, was a leading person organizing. Wikimedians the Kazakh language. So I guess this is another group that's organized around language rather than a country. So the Kazakh language, of course, is spoken in more than Kazakhstan, and Kazakhstan has more languages than one. Wiki Blind User Group focusing on blind Wikimedians and I guess things like screen readers and having accessibility. Para Wikimedians, also I'm sure focused on accessibility as well, and perhaps also written content related to ability to, and access topics. HGAPs. I'm not sure about this one. I think it's related to content gaps and systemic bias, but I'm not 100% sure.
Psychological science.
Psychological science. Okay, I was entirely wrong or mostly wrong, so I apologize for that. Wikimedia Community User Group Sudan, reflecting Sudan, the country of Sudan. Wikimedians of Western Armenian Language User Group. Western Armenian is a dialect of Armenian that is spoken primarily in the diaspora. So after the Armenian genocide, so spoken in Lebanon and much of the diaspora in the Western world, and I think perhaps in Russia as well. Indic Media Wiki Developers User Group focused on the Indic languages and making them play with MediaWiki properly, and perhaps Netha might have some input on this. Kurdish Wikimedians focused on the Kurdish languages and perhaps Kurdish culture. Wiki World Heritage User Group focused on the sort of sites that we use for Wiki Loves Monuments and other aspects of World Heritage that are on these UN registers that we like to use. Wikimediistas of Uruguay, of course, the country of Uruguay, and Wikimedians of the Uzbek Language User Group, another Central Asian language that is being represented by user group. And that is, to the best of my knowledge, what those user groups represent. I'm not totally prepared for this, but if people would want to share any of their feedback on, or any of their further knowledge on some of these user groups or their topic areas, please do.
To the best of your knowledge, that was incredible. You ran down every single one of them. That's great. Yeah, I did not realize that many affiliates were recognized in this past year. And I thought sustainable development had been around a lot longer than just this past year.
We just started in November, but it got recognized in January.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Great
but
work.
I'm quite impressed by the growth. So I think this is 20 new user groups. So we're now, if the templates on Meta is correct, we're up to 179 affiliates. And with 20 plus losing 2, that's a growth of about 10% or something like that, a little bit more even. So that's a lot.
So my goal for 2021 is 20 new chapters. I think there should be room for new chapters in the movement. In some ways, chapters are given a little bit more status than user groups, and I think it'd be great if more countries were able to have full chapters and the resources that go with that. Obviously, it takes a little bit more resources to develop a nonprofit officially, and also for thematic groups to be developed more. So 20 chapters, thematic groups in 2021.
Right.
20 might be optimistic, but
at least like 5 or 1 would be nice.
Yeah. I guess with the new process, you're supposed to be a user group for a number of years first, and I think we have a lot of them in the pipeline. So maybe it's not like if everyone tries to reach for the goal, it might be possible.
Yeah.
Right. All right, and finally, we are going to do 2021 predictions. So they don't have to be grand, they don't have to be earth-shattering, but I think it'd be interesting to find out what each person thought about what you see is happening in 2021. And it could be optimistic. It could be, off the charts if you want to. But I thought maybe we can start with Vera. What are you predicting for 2021, or what would you like to see happen?
Well, what I would like to see happen is more international collaboration to online conferencing. I would very much like the continuation of the trend we've already seen in the past year, where more people are able to attend conferences that they otherwise wouldn't be able to, and especially underrepresented regions that within Wikipedia aren't as extensively described as Europe is. So There's still a big world to gain when it comes to describing the world outside of Europe.
Great, thank you. How about you, Jan? What are your predictions for 2021?
I think we'll see some new tech, not totally new, but see it roll out more. So we have the Wikidata bridge that's already live on the Catalan Wikipedia, I think, in which you can edit Wikidata straight from the info box or from the Wikipedia page. You don't need to leave Wikipedia to edit Wikidata, and I think that's going to be huge, both in adaption and also in terms of quality of the content. And then my personal hope is also that we eventually now will see in 2021 the first beta of Wikispeech, where you get text-to-speech right into the interface. And I think it will roll out on Swedish, Arabic, and English Wikipedia during 2021. And since it's going to go out on English, I'm pretty sure it's going to be heavily debated.
Thank you. That's interesting. Yes, and editing Wikidata from within Wikipedia is a huge one. That's great. How about you, Richard? What are your predictions?
Yeah, so I think that with the emergence of wiki functions, we are going to see the emergence of a new dance craze, Wikifunk, which will sweep the Wikimania and the Wikimedia movements as soon as its safety allows. So looking forward to that. I also think that we might see some new ideas for new Wikimedia projects, new Wikimedia genres. And I'm not mean to favor one over the other, but I think now is the time. And I would say furthermore that we should have we might see a new synthesis. We might see a new Hegelian synthesis of some of the bottom-up community values and the top-down foundation values. And we might come to an agreement on the best way forward to work with the best of our corporate responsibilities and our volunteer ethos. And I think we might see some of these seemingly contradictory things come together in 2021, and that's my hope. So come for the 80% solution that 80% of people can go live along with, consensus forever.
Great, thanks. And how about you, Bill? What are your predictions?
So I'm going to swing for the fences with my prediction, and I'm going to predict, and I wouldn't call it a 90% prediction. I call it more like a 65% prediction. I'm going to go ahead and predict that there will be a new fork of a Wikimedia project away from the foundation. And it has been years, more than a decade, since I believe that last actually happened, when the Spanish fork occurred. If you know what it is, you know what it is. If you don't, you can look it up. Whereas, there have been other like projects that could be described as forks. You might call Everpedia a fork in some sense, although it didn't begin from the community. Well, I am positing that after years of tensions between the foundation and the community, and even division among affiliates over things like the naming, over things like the board elections and proposed bylaws changes, that somewhere it will come to a head, and there will be a number of editors who think, let's try to take this project and duplicate the information and go build it in a new direction. I don't really know where that's going to happen. I don't really know that it is going to happen, but it's the sort of thing that seems to me is ever more plausible. And as the disputes on Wikipedia continue, the chances of it happening approach 1.
Interesting. We should have a DEF CON meter in terms of like possibility of fork and where we are in that. But I think, given some of the things we talked about, it's not crazy to think that, and that's always the threat, right? So, yeah. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Netta, how about you? Predictions for 2021?
I think that we'll start making more and more international collaborations, and we'll become more global. I can already start seeing that people from different parts of the world are going to virtual conferences that are happening in other parts of the world, and they are like building up connections that way. So we'll need to wait out and see what happens of these connections. So in maybe a couple of years, we might see like collaborations that we hadn't previously thought of before COVID-19 times. So after COVID-19, people are seeing each other more online instead of going to like local meetups. So I think that we will be seeing some new cool things happening because of people cross-pollinating ideas from different language communities and different geographical areas. And a second thing I want to say is that we might see an increase in traffic to Wikimedia projects, because during the lockdown we saw that many people are going to the internet for information and entertainment. So, and from at least from the developing world, there are so many people who have started using internet for the first time after they have been under a lockdown. So, and when mobile phones are becoming cheaper every day, and the 5G, the internet connections, they are also becoming cheaper by day. So I think that people will start discovering the internet for the first time, and then they will eventually come to Wikipedia through their mobile devices from many places in the developing world. And this will lead to an increase in traffic maybe in the next couple of years, but eventually many of them will become Wikipedia editors also in the future. We never know about that. But one thing I can predict would be that we'll definitely see an increased traffic to our small language Wikipedias, as well as to maybe English Wikipedia, which is more of a global language.
Great, thank you. That's very, very consistent with some of the things we've seen. It'll be great to see more of that happen. And my prediction, which is not necessarily a prediction because I know it's going to happen, but not sure in what proportion, and I'm sure Liam is going to be happy to hear this as he's watching this. We will finally get a real database of citations in Wikipedia. So if you didn't know, anytime you add a reference to a Wikipedia article, it is just text on that article. That's it. You're not sharing your citation with anyone. You may be citing it for the 100th time, but you need to fix the author and the date string and all. We're not sharing citation data even within the same Wikipedia edition, which is insanity in 2020. So we might finally get WikiCite as a project to be a real thing that exists as a database of all citations used across all Wikipedia editions, which will allow for amazing things to happen. It will allow us to now check how often are we using Daily Mail, how often are we using New York Times in references, and maybe we can ferret out bad misinformation faster across all of our projects. So I think that is something that is on track to maybe happen in 2021. It has certainly been an interest of the WikiCite project for many years, but we might finally get a real implementation of that. And that would be huge because we've centralized images, centralized, authority control records like ISBN numbers, things like that. And now we might be able to centralize citations and references, which would be great. So let's bring in, for the last thing, some of the things that people brought on the comments for their predictions. Butch said, on 2021, we'll have better geo and thematic hubs. I think that's valid. That's one of the things that has been called for in the strategy, right? Thematic hubs and more hubs in the movement. Jan, some more elaboration on your wiki speech, perhaps?
Yes, so just to be clear, it's text-to-speech, so it's not meant to be searched by voice. It's rather getting your article read and then also read like live. So it's not it's not listened to someone reading it. It's synthesized voice.
Right.
But of course, open sourced.
Right. And the and also Witty Llama says, come talk to Witty Llama if you want more on that wiki site. He's shepherding this thing through, but it's one of the more exciting things happening in the movement right now, I think. But I want to thank all of our panelists here. We wanted to go an hour, and obviously we have not gone an hour. But there's just been too much to talk about for 2020. So I want to thank you all for participating, and we really want to see a lot of these things happen this next year. And I hope we can have a safer and maybe some in real life meetups in 2021, if they are practical.
Picnics.
What's that?
Picnics are the safest form, most COVID-friendly form of meetup.
Outdoors and distanced, right? So
you have to. You can't like share too much food, but yeah, picnics.
yeah, no sharing, but at least you're together, right? All right. So thanks everyone for the 2020 year in review. Hopefully you found it interesting, but keep sending your ideas and your predictions for 2021 in the comments on either YouTube or Facebook or Twitter. And we appreciate you watching and see you in 2021. Take care.
Bye.
Thanks, Andrew.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.